In this lesson, we will briefly review how to conjugate regular ere and ire verbs in the present tense, and then we will learn some of the irregular ere and ire verbs. To begin, let's briefly review how to conjugate ere and ire verbs, using scrivere to write and dormire to sleep as examples. Remember that to conjugate verbs, you remove the infinitive endings ere and ire, and then add the regular endings for the present tense. So for scrivere, when we remove ere, we're left with scriv, and then we add the regular endings o, I, e, llamo, ete, ono. And for ire verbs, the same process, remove the ire ending, we're left with dorm, and add the regular endings o, I, e, llamo, ite, one. Notice that the only difference between ere and ire verbs is in the voi form. For ere verbs, ete, for ire verbs, ite. Otherwise, they are identical in their conjugations. Now let's look at some irregular ere verbs. Bere, to drink, dovere, to have to, must, or to owe. Potere, to be able, and volere, to want. If we use bere as an example, if this were a regular verb, we would remove ere, which would leave us with just the letter B. And then if we were to add the regular endings, for example, the yo form, we would have B and then the O ending for yo, bo. As this is an irregular verb, it will not follow that pattern, and instead is conjugated as follows. Io bevo, tu bevi, lui o lei beve, noi beviamo, voi bevete, e loro bevono. For dovere, you can see similarly, when you remove the ere, you would be left with dove, but in the conjugations, you can see that in most of the conjugations, the O switches to an E. Devo, devi, deve, dobbiamo, dovete, devono. Potere, also irregular in the yo form, posso, so the T drops away and you have this double S. Puoi, può, possiamo, potete, possono. Volere, voglio, vuoi, vuole, vogliamo, volete, vogliono. You can see that with irregular verbs, the conjugated form sometimes is so different from the infinitive form that you wouldn't necessarily recognize it as being a conjugation of that verb, even if you know the infinitive. Say dovere, you're familiar with, but if you were to see the noi form, dobbiamo, you might not recognize it as being part of that verb. My best advice would be in the beginning to find a way to memorize these conjugations until they become automatic. Everyone has different tricks. I like repetition and sometimes just repeat conjugations over and over. Bevo, bevi, beviamo, bevi. Bevo, bevi, beve, beviamo, bevete, bevono, etc. But try to find what works best for you. Talk to your classmates, see what techniques other people have for memorizing. Here are some irregular ire verbs. Dire, to say or tell. Uscire, to go out. Venire, to come. Dire, dico, dici, dice, diciamo, dite, dicono. Uscire, esco, esci, esce, usciamo, uscite, escono. And venire, vengo, vieni, viene, veniamo, venite, vengono. I've given you an example here using the verb dire. Mia figlia Agata dice sempre perché, perché, perché. And finally we have sapere and conoscere. Both of these verbs are irregular ere verbs, and they both have the same translation. They translate as to know, but in Italian there's a distinction in how each is used. First, let's look at the conjugations. The verb sapere is conjugated as so, sai, sa, sappiamo, sapete, sanno. Conoscere, conosco, conosci, conosce, conosciamo, conoscete, conoscono. So sapere is used to describe a fact or information that is known. And it is also used to say you know how to do something. For example, lui sa cucinare bene. He knows how to cook well. You could replace that sentence with any other verb. Lui sa ballare bene. Lui sa parlare forte. Lui sa cantare. To make it negative, you just use no. It works just the same in the negative. Lui non sa cucinare bene. And also to know a fact, non sappiamo chi è. We don't know who that is. Conoscere, on the other hand, is used to say you're familiar with something or someone or someplace, and also to say, to describe meeting someone for the first time. So being familiar with something, conosci la musica siciliana? Are you familiar with Sicilian music? To describe being familiar with someone, Pina conosce mia cugina. Pina knows my cousin. I miei zii conoscono l'Italia. To be familiar with some place. My uncles are familiar with, they know, Italy. Voi conoscere mia zia? Here we have an example of meeting someone for the first time. Do you want to meet my aunt? So these differences can be a little tricky, but they'll start to become familiar before you know it. I usually just try to remember that conoscere is knowing a place, a person, or a thing, whereas sapere is knowing how to do something or knowing a fact. If you can keep those straight in your mind until they just become automatic, you'll be on the right track. So, quanto capisci? This is sort of a quiz to see if you can figure out how much you understood about sapere and conoscere. So I recommend pausing the video briefly and looking at these sentences and try to figure out, do you need sapere? Is it a sentence, is it know in the sense of knowing a fact or knowing how to do something? Or do you need conoscere, being familiar with a person or a place, or meeting someone, or being familiar with something? So pause briefly and then let's look at the answers. So here we have our answers. Io conosco la Italia. So it's I know in the sense I'm familiar with a place. I know Italy. Tu sai che ore sono? Do you know what time it is? So it's sapere, knowing a fact, knowing information. Loro sanno ballare tango. They know how to dance tango, so knowing how to do something. Voglio conoscere tua moglie. I want to meet your wife. So conoscere in the sense of meeting someone for the first time. This concludes our lesson on irregular ire and ere verbs. I hope you found the information useful.